Hi, everybody. Welcome to the end of the year activities for work sampling online. My name is Dr. Melissa Shamblott, and I'll be your instructor for this course. I'm looking forward to sharing some important information with you about things to do as we near the end of the year, and wanted just to comment that it's surprising how quickly our years go by and that we're almost to the end of another one. Hopefully you've been able to take advantage of some of our other webinar series this year and have been able to make use of some of the other tips and tools we've shared with you, strategies for working with children, working with online. And today's session we're going to focus specifically on some of the things we do as we prepare to end the year, specifically with work sampling. We'll be covering how to review and monitor data just in reference to preparing for the end of the year. A couple of things that are a good practices to take care of before we end the year, before we print reports, and before we prepare our data to export. I will be talking about creating and generating reports, both on the teacher side as well as some specific reports that can only be accessed on the administrator side. So we'll take a look at both formats during our session. We'll also talk a little bit about exporting data, and you can see here from the slide, there are different types of data to export, and when we get into the system, we'll have an opportunity to look at that. That's something that can only be done on the administrator side of work sampling online. Towards the end of our session, we'll talk a little bit about preparing classes for the new academic year, as well as transitioning students to the next class if you're in a program or setting where children might be staying on in your building or program for another year, or even in the event that they might be going on to another classroom or kindergarten classroom that's using work sampling online. There are also a few things that I'll share for children who will be leaving your program, not coming back in the following years, just some ideas about the kinds of things that you could think about sending to the next teacher, or at least sharing with families with the idea that they may be interested in sharing some of the documentation, such as portfolios or perhaps the summary report if you've worked on that part of work sampling, with the next year's teacher as a way to bridge the transition and to help next teacher understand what the child was doing when they were with you in your program. Let's take a look first at reviewing and monitoring data. I just want to share a little bit of information about what we mean by that, and then we'll move into looking at the online system so I can show you more specifically where you can do that and what kinds of things to think of when you're engaged in that process. We always want to make sure that our checklists are complete, and especially here at year end when we're preparing things in a little bit more of a formal way. The reports may be printed or shared, the data might be exported, information might be passed along to next teacher. So while it's always important to check our checklist for accuracy throughout the year, at the end of the year we really want to make sure that a few things are in place in order to have the greatest level of accuracy moving forward. Some of that involves making sure checklists are complete, looking for any inconsistencies that may be evident to us, or any areas that might be out of the norm, things that at glance, and once you glance through, just don't seem to make sense or don't look like the kind of information that you had intended to collect, or the kinds of ratings that you had planned to make for children. So we really will take a quick look at that. And then also another area to think about in terms of reviewing and monitoring data, and this really only applies to programs who are using the summary report in the work sampling system, would be reviewing summary reports to ensure quality. Because this is one of the main pieces in work sampling that we share with families, and in some cases pass along to the next year's teacher, it's really important that we have an opportunity to look them over carefully. If you're using the version of the summary report called the standard summary report, you may recall that it includes a couple of evaluative ratings, as expected or needs development are the types of ratings that we make. So we always want to make sure those are completed if that was the intention. And then also in the narrative section, just making sure that correct spelling and grammar has been used. And another thing to think about would be whether or not the comments truly reflect what you've learned about the child over the course of the year. So is there a match between the checklist ratings and the summary report comments, as well as the portfolio and the summary comments? We want them to make sense. We want them to connect. We also want it to be logical to families if they're going to be looking over their child's portfolio, why certain comments were written or shared by the teacher. So let's go in and take a look now at the online system. I've already logged in as a teacher. In a few minutes, we'll go back to look at the next couple of slides, and then we'll shift over and look at some of the things on the admin side. But as you probably remember, the work around the summary report is here, as well as information about the developmental checklist. So when we're at this point in the year and we're getting ready to go in and make sure things are complete and in order, one of the main things to look for initially is whether or not checklists have been finalized. I can see here that there's one for Joey Patterson that hasn't been finalized. So I'm going to go in and I'm going to take care of that. And as you remember, it's an easy process. We just simply click Flag as Final. Usually at this point, teachers have worked through all the developmental checklist indicators and domains that they're assigned, and so flagging as final is one of the ways we can make sure that this checklist data is now ready for any type of report that will be generated. I'm going to go back to the home page now. So we've had an opportunity to complete the finalization process. We can move over now into managing reports. And so first we're going to take a look at the summary report. And again, this would really only apply to those programs who are using this component in the system. If you're not familiar with this, this is a way that a system lets us know what's been completed. We're over here in period 3, the spring collection period, and we can see here that this teacher has done some work on Ashley Cooper's summary. So let's go in and take a look to see what's here. So this is the narrative summary if you're not familiar with this. And because I clicked Include Standard Summary Assessments, this summary report also includes evaluative ratings. There's one for the checklist, and then there's one for progress. The system automatically populates the checklist evaluative rating because it's based on the not yet, in processes, and proficient ratings that the teacher has made on the developmental checklist. So using an algorithm built into the system, Work Sampling Online automatically assigns the as expected or the needs development. Teachers go in, however, and manually make the progress rating, and here we can see the teacher has given Ashley an as expected for progress. We do expect children to make progress during each collection period, so if the teacher has not noted progress for a particular child, then he or she would select needs development instead. This evaluative rating in work sampling is based on whether or not a specific child, has made progress since the beginning of the last collection period. So we would ask, has Ashley made progress in personal and social development since the winter collection period? And in this case, she has. The teacher has also been in and created some narrative comments. When we're writing narrative comments, we stick to writing a strength for the child. We talk about some concerns or challenges, and it's also an opportunity to write some instructional goals for the child. Because it's year end in this case, Ashley's teacher has written a goal, a suggested goal for family to try at home over the summer. Here we can see the teacher is recommending that over the summer, Ashley would benefit from opportunities to play with peers and to practice using her words and managing her feelings when she's frustrated. So this gives the family an idea of some of the things that they might do to support Ashley over the course of the summer. One other thing I wanted to point out is there's a feature in the summary report that allows a teacher, when they're completing a checklist, you can see checklist comments, to write something that would be pertinent or something that might be helpful or valuable to include in the summary report. And if a teacher has taken time to do that at the point of completion of a checklist, it's a very easy process to include this comment in the summary. All the teacher needs to do is click Add Comment, and now that comment has moved over and can be a part of the narrative summary. There is also another feature that I wanted to point out. It's called a template comment, and I'm going to move down here to the domain of language and literacy for this example. Although the summary report narrative comments are designed to be individual to children, there are some things teachers might say that would be in common to all children, things that have to do with curriculum themes or topics, or areas that children worked on collaboratively. And here we can see the teacher is creating a template comment about the children working on creating a classroom community together. She's sharing that the children all have a job and that they take turns feeding the pets and watering the plants, and that together the children have decided to call the community our class. The reason I wanted to point this out is because this is something that might be appropriate for other students' checklists as well. So with the first checklist created, the teacher can write the template comment and then go up here to the top and click Save Template. And when the teacher does that, it makes it so that that template comment will then be available for every other child in the classroom. So when the teacher moves into working with the next student, she would simply click Use Template, and this comment would appear on the next child's language and literacy narrative comment section. So a really great time saver, and I wanted to make sure I pointed that out if you're not familiar with that feature. I know it can take time to write summary comments at the end of the year along with all the other things teachers are typically tasked with, so it can be a helpful tool to at least be aware of if your program is using the summary report. In terms of reviewing and monitoring the data, we would just want to review the comments. We would want to check for clear spelling and grammar. We would want to make sure the comments match up with the checklist ratings as well as the progress rating and any portfolio collection pieces that have been collected. We would want to see some consistency there between what's being collected and saved and perhaps being ready to send home with the narrative comments. So reading through the commentary, making sure it makes sense, making sure it's family friendly, and written in a way that would be appropriate for your population. Different groups have different abilities in terms of their reading, and so we want to make sure that our narrative comments are always a good fit for the population that we're serving. And in the case where the population that you're serving might have challenges with reading, perhaps they're just learning to read the English language, you may want to write with bulleted phrases or in another format that would be easier for a person learning English to read through. And then on the other end of the spectrum, we have lots of families who read and write fluently, and for those families, perhaps more writing, such as the writing here, would be appropriate. When we're writing narrative comments, we typically stick to writing the strength, the concern, and the challenge, and the goal as a formula, regardless of the family, because those are the things we want to communicate with the narrative summary report. Let's head back over now to look at some additional slides. And we'll move into looking at some other parts of our ending of the year processes and procedures. So now we're going to take a look at generating reports and exporting data. We'll start with a look first at things on the teacher side, and then we'll also take a look in this opportunity to see some things over on the administrator side that can only be generated on the administrator side. So just to review, there are different kinds of outcomes reports in Work Sampling Online. There is one called a class profile that can only be accessed on the teacher side, and another called the class ratings report that can only be accessed on the teacher side. Here's an example of the class profile. In this report, the information comes directly from the checklist, and here you can see the first domain, personal and social, along with the first functional component, and then performance indicators all in order. At the top, you can see the not yet for the not yet rating, in process, proficient, not applicable, or did not observe, as well as a no response in case there was nothing done for that particular child. And then just below each rating, you can see the names of the children according to the ratings that they received. So this report, again, can only be generated on the teacher side, but can be very handy in terms of looking at where children are at. In many programs, there may be a couple weeks left before you actually end your school year, and so if you've completed your checklists, you can go in and print this and have an opportunity to still use the information to pair children, to plan curriculum. You can think about different strategies for using this kind of information as you end out the year. So again, this is only available on the teacher side, and you may see here that it says that it is possible to generate this report before you finalize. Before we finalize, we call a rating a preliminary rating, and so if teachers have gone in and made the ratings that they are likely to stick with but have not yet finalized, you could still generate this report and have an opportunity to use it before the end of the year. This next report is called the Class Ratings Report. This is the second one that can only be generated on the teacher's side. And in part with these two reports, the reason they're generated only on the teacher's side is because they include students' names. So these students are in a particular class. When we move over to the administrator side, although administrators can see the children that are enrolled in the program and the children that are assigned to each classroom, when it comes to running reports on the administrator's side, the names of children are not revealed. It's more about how a class did or a subgroup of a class. So administrators, if you're interested in either of these reports, because they show the names of students, then you can use your navigation tools to go over to each classroom and go into the report feature, which I'll show you in just a minute, and generate these reports, or at least open them up to take a look at them, because there could be some information that's helpful for you. This one, too, based on personal social with the functional component and the performance indicator, with names of children and then the ratings that have been assigned. When we move into the system, we'll have an opportunity to look at some reports that have all three collection periods completed. Just before we head over, we're going to talk a little bit about the outcomes report. So when we get there, you can make use of the information. There's a couple different things that we do, making demographic selections. We can choose whether or not we generate our outcome report at the domain level, meaning for the entire domain, the system averages all the ratings. For example, in personal social, there are 12 indicators. It looks across all the checklists that have been completed and finalized and averages that information into a report. We can also make a selection of a functional component, which would be the next level down. For example, in language and literacy, we have reading, writing, speaking, and listening, and perhaps you're interested in having a report run at that level. And then we can go all the way down to the performance indicator level for the most specific information and data that supports each of the individual performance indicators on the checklist. When you're creating reports, especially for you administrators, because you might be including a lot of checklists depending on the size of your program, multiple classrooms, perhaps even multiple sites that you work with. The report can take some time to generate. The system goes through all the checklists, looks over all the ratings, and then puts together the report sort of behind the scene. In that case, it sends you a little message saying that your report is being generated. You can go back to work either in online or in something else you're working on, and then it will notify you by email. Teachers, your reports typically won't take that long to generate because your capabilities are to create reports for the class or classes that you teach, so it typically isn't quite as long of a procedure. You can save your reports on your desktop, you can save them on a thumb drive, or you can print them out. I wanted just to show you what a sample outcome report looks. like. This one is done at the domain level, personal and social development. You can see the key here, not yet. Ratings are red, in process are yellow, and blue is for proficient. Here we can see in the fall of the year, period 1, the majority of children have the not yet rating, with a couple in the in-process rating. And then in the winter collection, there were no children with a not yet rating in this domain across all 12 indicators, the majority of children with an in-process rating, and a couple who were showing proficiency in the winter. And then by the spring, period 3, we can see still no one in not yet, fewer in process, and the majority in proficient. And this is a typical pattern that we would likely see with the growth and development of children over the course of a year. And I just wanted to reiterate, too, that in work sampling, we work with the developmental guidelines, and the developmental guidelines represent what we would hope for children at the end of the year. So this type of profile here in the outcome report makes sense based on that. We typically see more not yet ratings in the fall of the year, and then as children have exposure to different learning opportunities and activities and experiences, not to mention just their natural growth and development, we would typically expect to see more children proficient by year end. But you can see here, we don't necessarily see all children proficient. We work towards that goal, but a lot of what happens in the classroom is based on each child's individual development. So even with excellent teaching and opportunities and experiences, that's not necessarily a guarantee that all children will be proficient. We work towards that goal, but we also understand and respect that child development has its own pattern, and we work with children as they develop over time. All right, one last thing before we take a look at the report, just so that it makes the most sense to you when we go to see it. At the bottom of each outcome report, you'll see different types of information. One type of information that you'll see will give you what we call the mean and gains reports, or the domain comparison summary. You can see here it's for all 7 domains. The mean rating is the average of the indicator ratings in each period. So here in period 1 for personal and social, we see that when averaged, the ratings were a 1.53. A 1 equals a not yet, a 2 equals in process, and a 3 equals proficient. So a 1.53 is somewhere between a not yet and in process rating. So the average of the children were somewhere in between those two. In period 2, we can see that although most children were around the in process, some had inched towards proficient, which would give us the 2.10, and towards period 3, what we saw in the report was the average was about a 2.69. So lots of children were showing proficiency, but there were also many, or several, still in the in-process category. The gains help us to see from period 1 to period 2 what kinds of gains were made. So from fall to winter in this report, we can see there was the 0.58 gain. We can see from winter to spring, there was a little bit more of a gain, and from fall to spring, a 1.17. So one of the things you can do with the gains is you can quickly look from top to bottom to identify the domain that had the greatest gains. In this case, it was social studies. So we have some information about that. We can also identify those domains that had the least gains and may want to investigate a little bit to see what was going on. Here we can see in this class anyway, it was the arts that had the fewest gains. So as an administrator and teacher, you might want to take a special look at your curriculum, see what was going on in the arts, see if there were enough opportunities for children, maybe check to see if there was enough information embedded throughout the classroom to support the arts, which can often be the case where we're not seeing the kinds of gains that we want to see. While I was saying that, you noticed I moved on over to the report section so that we can look at the online system. First, we're going to take a look on the teacher side, and then we'll move over to look at how things look or how we can put things together on the administrator side. This is also a place that you can print the developmental checklist. Let's start here, though, with the class profile. So when we come to the class profile, we always want to select our age or grade level. We want to select our period. Now we're going to take a look at period 3, and we'll start with the first domain. And this was the chart we looked at in the slides. You can see here for personal social, self-concept, demonstrate self-confidence. There were no students in not yet at year's end, couple and in process, and a few in proficient. Nobody was rated not applicable. If you recall from earlier opportunities to learn about the ratings, the not applicable is used when the information or the indicators have not yet been introduced or taught. So it makes sense at year end that most of what's on a developmental checklist for each age or grade level would be covered by year's end. Another time to use a not applicable would be if you have any students with identified special needs for whom a cluster or some of the indicators are not an appropriate fit. We always use the thinking of if it's reasonable and appropriate for a child. And with children with special education disabilities, there may be some indicators or a cluster of indicators or in some cases an entire domain that might not be a good fit for that child. Those are usually children who have an individual education plan or an IEP. And when you study an IEP, you can begin to see this very specific goals and objectives that have been designed specifically for that child in that area. And in that case, we sort of use a dovetailing approach of the IEP and the developmental checklist. We also see that none of the students here have been rated did not observe, and that makes sense too. Usually towards the end of the year, fewer children are new students in the classroom, which is sometimes why a teacher might opt for a did not observe. We often advise that if a child joins a classroom close to the end of the collection period, the teacher may not have that opportunity to observe and document that child relative to all the indicators, and we always advise not to guess on any checklist ratings. So in that case, a teacher might mark a did not observe and then make a plan to observe that child throughout the collection period. So at year's end, there tend to be fewer children just joining the class as a brand new student. So we wouldn't necessarily see did not observe being selected at this time in the year. These can be downloaded, these can be printed, and again can still be valuable now because they can be based on preliminary checklist ratings and could be used to do some strategizing and planning before year's end. We'll go back to the home page just to orient and back into Manage Reports. So the second type of report, again, that can only be generated on the teacher side is the class ratings. Here we give a little title. We'll just call this one Ratings. For this school year, again, we're going to select our age or grade level. For programs that are working with both 3 and 4-year-olds or kindergarten, first, second, or third grade, we always make a selection of the grade level. All reports are specific to a single grade level, and that has to do with that the developmental guidelines in the work sampling system are specific to each age or grade level. So the checklist ratings are different on the checklist, as are the rationales or the criteria that we use to evaluate and the examples that you'll see. It is also true that there are some commonalities in the indicators. Demonstrate self-confidence, for example, in personal social development is the first indicator across all the checklists. But what's different, again, are those rationales or the criteria and the examples. So we always want to specify which level we want the report drawn at. And if you serve multiple age groups, you can go in and make different selections and run different reports specific to each age or grade. In this report, you can select all domains or a single domain. We'll just pick personal and social development for now. You can see here in the left-hand corner, it comes up as a PDF. And let me expand it a little bit. It comes up a little bit small at first. And so we'll go in and we can see here much like what we saw before, but now it's entirely filled with information. We see personal and social development, self-concept, the performance indicators, the names of the children along the left. We can also see the pattern of ratings. And so with this report, we can see quite a lot of information all at one glance, which is sometimes why an administrator might be interested in this type of report, because it's an excellent tool for identifying gaps in ratings if a particular indicator has not been completed. We could see that. If a child has been altogether missed, perhaps it's a child who's left the program and should be deleted or archived. So at a glance with this report, we have the opportunity to see quite a lot of information. Now that we have 3 collection periods, initially when it's only the first collection period, we tend to look top to bottom to look for patterns and ratings. When it's 2 collections, we can begin to look left to right, and when it's 3 collections, we continue to look left to right to look for patterns in growth or any kind of discrepancies or areas that look a little bit out of the norm. We can see for the most part it looks complete, and for example here with Ashley, we see in this indicator she had in process and then proficient, and that makes sense. And then for Anna Jackson, the next student down, we can see she remained in process in this indicator throughout the year. One thing that sticks out though is we can see that Sandra Roberts, there are some gaps in the data here. So we would want to follow up to see why that is. It looks like this checklist for this child hasn't been fully completed. So this one can be very, very helpful for identifying those gaps and also noticing just the typical patterns and trends in children's development over the course of the year. Again, you can run this for all 7 domains at once, or you can select them one by one, as I did in the case here. So let's take a quick look here now at class outcomes on the teacher side. So again, just to reiterate, teachers can make create outcome reports based on the children that they serve. So lots of teachers are just working with a single class, or some teachers have more than one class, so a teacher can make those selections right here on the right. Before we do that, though, I want to point out what I'd mentioned before. We can make a selection of the domain level, and the example we saw earlier in the slide presentation was at the domain level. It was for personal and social, and all 12 indicators in that domain had been aggregated and averaged by the system. Functional component or performance indicator, and making these different selections will give you different kinds of information that we can glean different types of interpretations from. Some are useful for certain purposes. Others might provide a careful look, for example, at performance indicator look into how children did on each specific indicator. So it's important at this point to think about what are your purposes in generating the report. What do you want to do with the report? What are you hoping to see? Who are your potential audiences? All those decisions will help you determine which type of report you want to create. Because we've looked at the domain level, we'll go ahead and select functional component for this example. And once again, we make a selection of the age or grade level. We would want to take a look here at the grouping. So the system will allow a teacher to make some selections. A report could be run on boys versus girls, those children with an IEP, individual education plan, or an IFSP. So what the program will do is show you how the children with an IEP are doing data-wise compared to the entire class, so that you can get a sense of how those children are making progress. You can also make selections by language group or ethnicity group to take a closer or more careful look at how each of those groups are doing. And again, it shows you how each specific group is doing compared to the overall data for the class. At year end, we want to make sure that period 1, 2, and 3 are selected. We can also make some selections here of which domains. We'll go ahead and unselect some of these. And this teacher covers quite a few different classes, so we're going to unselect several of them so that we're just looking at this teacher's school readiness class. And then we simply submit. And it's a very easy process. Usually with a single class in one domain, depending on the number of children, the report generates fairly quickly, as you can see here. If we had made any other selections, for example, performance indicator for multiple classes, it would take longer. Here we can see functional component for preschool 4. We can see it's just specific to this class. We can also see that this report is 9 pages. And in part, that has to do with the fact that we did select functional component for this example. As we move down, there's a couple, page 1 and 2 provide some general information, a quick overview of information of what types of categories we look at for demographics, what types of groupings there are. And when we were looking at that specific feature where you can make some of those selections, here's the breakdown of some of the things you could select. In the system, many of you see these language groupings and ethnicity groupings. Some programs may have additional language or ethnicity groups added in depending on the population that you serve. So these first 2 pages just provide some general information, which could be very helpful for someone who's not familiar with work sampling, just to give them a little bit of an idea which groups do we look at or how do we look at the domains. As we move down, we get additional information. This particular page is showing us the completion rate. We can see in this case there are 6 children enrolled in the class, and this teacher has completed 100% for the active children, and there aren't any children in this class in what we call the archive. And we get just a few other demographics here in both bar graph, percentile, and then a numerical match to the right. And so this again is just some demographic information. And as we move down, we can see more information about completion rates. As we're going down, we can see here this must be Sanders, 1 indicator missed. And then when we get down, here was the mean and gains rating that I was sharing with you earlier. We can get at a glance an idea of the average. Here in this class for functional component self-concept, even in the fall, kids were many in process. As we see towards the end of the school year, period 3, they weren't all proficient, but they were more than halfway there between in process and proficient. So again, lots of really, really valuable information, all at a glance. Again, we asked for functional component for a single domain, and that's why we're seeing these 4 areas here with this type of information. All right, and then we get to our outcome summary, and we can see here for self-concept how things looked for the children over the course of the year. More in processes and some proficiency even in the fall, same in the winter, and then in the spring we can see there were fewer in process and more proficient. But as I mentioned, not everyone is necessarily going to be proficient at year end. So then we look down a little bit further, and here are some of those other statistical measures that I mentioned. We get information about the no data, the not yet in process and proficient ratings. We can also look down to see here, once again, the mean rating or the average of the ratings calculated by the system, as well as the standard deviation. So depending again on your purposes and what you plan to do with the information, this could be helpful. Some people are creating reports and looking very closely at the standard deviation, where others might be more interested in just looking at each of the bar graphs to chart the pattern of growth over time in this particular group of children for the functional components selected. All right, so that's the 3 reports, class profile, class ratings, and class outcomes that can be generated on the teacher side. As we navigate over now to the administrator side, you'll notice that instead of evidence, we now have manage. That's one way we can differentiate the 2. We also have the communicate feature, and the reports feature, what we'll be looking at now. There are a couple different things an administrator can look at. Because towards the year end we have interest in making sure that all teachers are done with their checklist, an administrator might want to go in and take a look at how teachers are doing, depending on when your last day of school is and when the anticipated or expected date for checklist completion, if there's a date that's used across the entire program or across the entire district or city. It's important to have an idea of how teachers are doing and how close to completion they may or may not be. Here we can see that in this class with 22, there are 17 that have been completed. So we know this teacher has been working on that completion in the system. And so encouragement for the teacher can be very helpful, and also just to check in to see if there's anything that an administrator can do to support the teacher as they near out the end of the year. We can also take a quick look too at the summary to see if it's required in your program, how teachers are doing in completing their summary. We're going to take a look here at outcomes report. So this is in some ways similar to what we saw on the teacher side, but an administrator has some additional options in terms of selection. Still the same three here. We can also see the selection of the academic year, the selection of age or grade level. Selection of grouping is the same, periods to include is the same, and as we look over on the right, we can see some of the demographic filters as well as the domains. As we scroll down, however, in the outcome report feature for administrators, we can see that there's a couple other things that can be selected. One would be including students with data in all requested collection periods. So that would mean if children had entered the year mid-year and some perhaps didn't have fall checklists or perhaps even winter checklists, you're making a decision about who to include. Do you only want your report run on children who are with you for all three collection periods, or are you interested in seeing whoever's in the system right now who has a completed checklist? And depending on your population and the enrollment, and some of your programs may have not even been active or started until mid-year. So that decision is specific to each program as to who you want to include in your report. The one that's selected here include active students. So those would be kids who are active in the system right now. And as you can see from the little message, you can uncheck this selection if you'd also like to include students who've been placed in the archive. The archive, just to review, is a place that you can place students who have left the program, for whom you have collected data, whether it's observation notes or checklist data, perhaps some summary reports have been completed. If a child leaves the program and you have reason to believe that they might be back, or you're not sure and you want to preserve the data, then placing them in the archive is a good idea because it keeps all the data safe and secure. And then if they do come back, you can reactivate that child into the class, and all the data will have been preserved. The other option when children leave is to delete them from the system. And if there is any data saved for that child, when you delete the child, all of the data is deleted too. So it's important to think carefully about that decision, who to delete and who to archive, so that you can preserve anything that has been documented and completed and saved. An administrator also has a selection of different teachers. Let's say that these three are represent classrooms that the administrator is interested in having this data report, this specific report generated for. So then we would go ahead and submit. And again, because in the administrator's setup of the report, it is calling out more data. It's going through different classrooms. It's looking at different checklists. It's attending to your demographic filters. It can take longer to generate the report, and so you may have noticed the message up here that was just letting you know you can go back to work, and as soon as your report is done, the system will let you know that your report is done. It sends it to the email that's a part of the system. If you're not sure what email the system has, you can easily go up here to your profile to take a quick look at that. And maybe because it's summer, or there's going to be some shifts in your program, maybe you're moving to another building, you're going to have a different email, you can always change that on your own and make sure that your report messages, along with any other correspondence from Work Sampling Online, is sent to the correct email address. The other thing that an administrator, we strongly advise that you do two things towards the end of the year. Make your selections of what types of outcome reports you want and generate them. Again, you don't have to print all the reports. You can save them on your desktop. You can put them on a thumb drive. You can print some if you want to share them. But the other important thing to do after you've done your report selections and generation is to export the student data. And we recommend that all users do this to preserve your data in a numerical format. So there are a couple different exports that you can look at. The user export will export all the user or teacher and or administrator information that's in the system to an Excel file. So names of teachers, username, all that type of information that's been put into the system. Same with the student export. An Excel file will be created based on the demographics for students in the system. Name, birth date, ethnicity, language, all that information, just the demographic information. And then for programs that have multiple sites, you can also do a location export that will export specific information about each of your locations or sites if you serve multiple programs or schools. Another very important one that relates to the checklist data is the assessment data export. So we'll take a quick look at that. Again, it's set for this academic year. You can make your selection of which age or grade level, which periods. If you've served children across all three periods, we recommend that you save the data for all three periods. And you can make a selection here if you want final data, preliminary data, or all the data. And that will help the system know what type of data to include in your Excel report. And then you simply click Export. It's an extremely easy process. And we really strongly encourage that you do this. It just gives you another way to save your data. And here's an example of that report, just letting you know that the export data was submitted and that an email will be sent to you when that report is done. And it's a good idea to save that somewhere on your desktop or in a file specifically marked for assessment exports. It's just a good way to preserve your data. And then if you ever need to go back and look at information, you can use that report to look for any patterns and ratings, or if anyone is asking for specific information about a particular child or a particular site, you would have it saved in a numerical format in your files for safekeeping and also for further analysis. All right, I want to head back to our slides just to reiterate a couple things here. The data export is the really important one, and it's up to each program. You can make decisions about what relevance the user, student, or site data would have for you in an export. And then again, just reiterating, it can be saved wherever you want, usually in some kind of a confidential folder that can be accessed by you and other administrators, perhaps in your program, as appropriate. As we move into thinking about the next school year, for many of you that would be next fall when children would be coming back to your program. You may have questions about what should you be doing in the online system to get ready for next year. And so there are some things that you can do ahead of time, and some of you may have information for some of these areas now, and others of you may just be able to ready the system in preparation for rosters of children or locations. Teachers sometimes I know are not hired till later in the summer, and so you don't have to have all that information now, but there are some things you could do in preparation for next fall. And this, again, assumes that you have already generated your reports and exported the data that you are interested in preserving. So after that, you can go in and delete or archive children who have left or will be leaving the program. If your program only serves children that are 4 years old and then they move on into kindergarten and you don't plan to serve them again, then you can delete them. If a child is going to be repeating, for example, a 4-year-old year, then putting them in the archive might make more sense. Some of you will also have children who are going to stay on with you. Let's say you have 3-year-old classrooms. Many might be coming back for next year in a 4-year-old classroom. You can put those children into the archive as well. You can create new teachers and classes as needed, and again, some of you will know that towards the end of this year, and others may not, but those are things you can do in preparation. Once you've done that, you can transfer any children who are staying into the new class. Maybe you have a new teacher coming on board and that teacher will have a new classroom. You can move the children either if you've placed them in the archive, or there is a transfer feature that an administrator can work with where you simply are transferring a child from one classroom to another or from one teacher to another. Any teachers who are leaving your program for whom you've set up a username, you can go ahead and delete them. And then once you have your roster of new children, you can add those into the classrooms that you've set up. So straightforward process and procedures, but I know it's a common question that programs have. It's always nice to do a little something in the spring in preparation for next fall, so that when fall comes and you're getting back to work, if that's your work situation, that you have some things in place. Maybe then all you would need to do is add in new children or add in new teachers and classes and new children. You can also be thinking about how that part of the process will be handled. Who will be adding in new children? Will it be administrators? Will it be teachers? Will it be a combination? So those are processes and procedures that you can think about in the spring as you prepare for the next year, just to be more prepared and ready when that time comes. The last area that we're going to look at is transitioning children to the next class. This might be a class that's housed within your program. Maybe you are a program that serves 4-year-olds and kindergartners, or 3-year-olds and 4-year-olds, or perhaps you're an elementary school serving children across the age of grade levels. Many of you will be serving children who are going to go on to another program that may or may not have work sampling in place. So you'll think about what situation fits your population and your program, and make some decisions about what to send home with the children. One thing that's always very important to send home is any portfolio work that's been collected or saved for children. Many programs are in the practice of collecting and saving portfolio pieces over the course of the year. Sometimes programs have selected certain areas and have tried to select pieces that represent those areas of learning and are showing progress over time. Others may have just a collection of work. At some point, the portfolio should get home to the child and the family, and so if the family is leaving your program, sending it home makes sense in the spring of the year. If the child and the family are likely to be back in your program next year, you have a fairly good idea or are confident that's the case, you might opt to pass the portfolio on to the next teacher, who could then meet and greet the child and the family in the fall with last year's portfolio and use that as a springboard for talking about the upcoming year, and then the portfolio could be sent home. Other things to send home with children would be artifacts that they've created. Anything the child has created is usually what we send home. The other thing we send home, not necessarily with the child, but given to the parent, would be the summary report. Those two pieces, portfolio and summary, are designed to be sent home to families. The observation notes are not something we share with families, and the checklists are not something that are designed to be shared with families. So those should remain on site, and as a program, you can decide what to do. Maybe you're just comfortable having it archived and saved in your exported files or the reports that you've generated, and some programs may also opt to print out checklists and keep them on site. If the child will be going on to a teacher that you know in the next year, either in your own program or if you're in a smaller community where you have a fairly good idea which kindergarten, for example, that the child might be going to, you could consider sending something to that teacher. It may not be the entire portfolio, but there can be letters sent to the next teacher giving them information about work sampling. In some cases, a program might prepare a special form that the child can draw a picture and maybe have an opportunity to dictate something they would like to tell their next teacher. And so you can think about if there's anything like that that would be appropriate for the next year's teacher. Sometimes programs will send the summary report to the next teacher, and in some cases a portfolio piece, a single piece, for example, of emergent writing might be selected and sent to the next teacher along with the summary report. Those are the common things that we see sent. You might also, if your program logistics allow, consider meeting with the child's next teacher or including some sort of a letter about work sampling to inform the next teacher and program about the kind of work you did to document, evaluate, and assess children, especially if you'll be sending any work sampling documents and the next teacher isn't aware of what work sampling is. That could be very helpful and informative. And then a last idea is that you might have a plan in your program to give all the information to families at the end of the year and have a conversation with them or attach some kind of a memo or a letter for them, encouraging them to bring their child's portfolio and summary to share with the next year's teacher. Then as they arrive, for example, in kindergarten, the family has that information and can begin the school year talking with the kindergarten teacher about the kinds of things that their child did in their early childhood education classroom, in their preschool classroom, and have that as a way to communicate with the next teacher and begin the year with a bit of a reflection on what the child did, for example, in their 4-year-old year, and which would often lead naturally to a discussion about what will be happening in the upcoming year. So those are some of the ideas that we want to share just about transitioning to the next class. Again, a lot of it is very specific to the student population that you serve, the families that you work with, the size of your program, and also whether or not children will be returning to your program or going on to another program in your community, such as a kindergarten. So think carefully about that. There's a lot of wonderful information in the work sampling system that could be very valuable for a next teacher or a next program to use as a way to learn about the child as a learner in previous years, and then to make some decisions about how to build on that experience for a greater and higher level of continuity across age or grade level. Well, that's what we have for today for year end. Really want to thank you for taking time. I know this is a very busy time in every school and program. The preparation for the end of the year can have a lot of elements and aspects to it. So we appreciate your taking the time today to learn a little bit more about how to ready the online system and to think about the documentation that you've been working so hard to collect over the year, what to do with it as children move on into another age or grade level in your program or another program altogether. Thanks, everybody.